for the final meeting of School Forum for this academic year. For those who don't know me, I am Graham Wilkins. I'm Vice Chair to School Forum. In the absence of Alan Hardy, I've been asked to chair this meeting today. So we'll go straight into, obviously, the agenda, which you all should have had received, and all the minutes and everything of the meeting, right? So membership and membership update. Can you anything, Bruce?
We've had one successful appointment. Sarah Smith from Scrumiston First School has joined Schools Forum and will be joining us, unfortunately, because she's had to send apologies for this meeting, but is very keen to get involved.
Okay, right, thank you. We'll welcome her at the next meeting, when obviously will be online. Item 2 of the agenda, apologies for absence. I believe it's, you have about at least half a dozen of them, please, if you could read them out for the record.
We do. The Chair of Schools Forum, Alan Hardy, has sent his apologies. Some people may be aware, Alan unfortunately had an accident when he was out jogging, so he's not as mobile as he'd want to be. He is making progress. He's had a plaster cast removed, but will be unable to join us today. He's just asked me to specifically pass on his thanks to all of Schools Forum for their contribution and their work during the course of the year, as well as council officers for their input as well. So, thanks.
Okay, now.
Other apologies are specifically from Barbara Mansfield, Barry Reid, Sarah Smith, and from officers Abby Russell, Dave Cookson and Audrey Kingham.
Right, thank you. Right, item 3 on the agenda, disclosure of any interest. Is there any? If you can just obviously identify, if not, then it recorded there is none other. Okay. Minutes and matters arising of the School Forum, who met online on the 14th of February 2024, which I was actually in the chair on that one. So we'll firstly do with the accuracy of these minutes. So page 1. Page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, and page 6. Do you agree, those present at that meeting, they are a true record? Right, just so obviously, we can just obviously record it so we can record who actually said it, okay? Right. Any matters arising, obviously there's not much on page 1, but on at the beginning of the minutes, page 2, any matters arising on this? Not in part of the agenda. Page 3, any matters arising? Page 4, any matters arising? Page 5, any matters arising? And page 6, any matters arising? No. Do you agree now I sign these as a true record with no matters arising? Okay, I'll have a copy which I will sign and pass to the clerk later on. Okay, thank you. Right, the communication, you saw that communication. I take it, Bruce, you're going to just deal with the communication and
yes.
item 5, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Again, very briefly, obviously we do receive a number of notifications through from the F40 group. And that was highlighting a specific article which had appeared in Schools Week. I thought it was worth highlighting that the DFE are, to quote Tom Goldman, actively looking at reforms to the 10K Special Schools Place funding, which again has been at the same level for probably approximately 10 years now. So we await further information in relation to that.
Okay, so that's just obviously for information for you. Yeah. Well, thank you, Bruce. Item 6, DSG provision of outrun. That's our new man here, obviously Callum. So over to you, Callum, if you can obviously present the paper, please.
Yeah, no problems.
You need to put your microphone on. Okay.
There we go. So, can we put the report on?
Have you all got a copy of it in front of you? Most of you got
yeah, you should have all received a copy ahead of this. This is the outturn. We'll get there. Yeah.
Yes, just come up here.
There we go. Okay. So this is the outturn for the 2023-24 position. With the dedicated schools grant, we now record all the school blocks separately. So throughout the report, they will be recorded. You will see the separate blocks, and you will see the individual positions throughout. There are some recommendations in item 2 on this report, which I propose that we'll come back to at the end once you've seen the background and the current position. So the budget for last year was essentially allocated by DFE. Then you get the recoupment taken off, and there was a transfer from the schools block to the high needs block of 485,000. That budget was agreed in January, February, and the early years block budget is essentially still under scrutiny. It's still to be announced by DFE, as it always is for the previous year, because it's taken between census points, and only the following year you're able to see essentially the difference between them census points on the early years take up, which then changes the budget allocation for last year and potentially then for future years going forward, because it will change the carry forward position and may impact our funding allocations. So going into 23-24, we had £4.501 million reserve across all balances. In that, from 22-23, we had 4.501 million. Throughout the year, we were left with a balance of 2.067 to meet future years. If we go to the outturn position in item 4, we can see how the budget was split between the blocks. You can see the expenditure and the outturn position. Central schools block and early years block relatively on target, and it should be no surprise to anybody here that the high needs block is overspent and over relied on and overdrawn. So whilst it says there at the top there's a significant overspend of 1.847 million, that is including a transfer from the high needs block reserve into the budget, and that transfer was 1.876 million. The overall position for the DSG was £908,000 overspend. Again, that is including the high needs block reserve transfer. The reasons for the individual underspends and overspends I'll go through now as part 5. We'll start with the central schools block, which had an underspend of 143,000. Over the previous years, we've had independent school placements for children without EHCPs, and it's, to be honest, gone up and down over the past years. At this same point a year ago, there were 5 that were in care without EHCPs that we then uplifted the budget slightly to, because we recognised that there was a demand here. Now I'm sitting here and there's 3. So therefore, there is a generated underspend of £89,000 in that area. The admissions team was slightly underspent due to a vacant post and a contribution from Homes to Ukraine grant, which we were able to use to fund part of salaries in that area. Any staffing underspends, such as those were temporary, do not continue and are non-recurrent, so they cannot be relied on in future to sort of bring down any overspends. Part of the Working with Schools budget, the DSG side was underspent, generally because of the redevelopment projects, and we're waiting to essentially see how much in future that costs us in terms of legal fees and potential academisations on top of that. The early years block was actually remarkably straightforward and on target. We had a staffing vacancy, and we were part of the Experts and Mentors Grant Pilot Scheme, which continues into this year, generating a £51,000 underspend. We'll move on to the high needs block, which is an overspend of 1.847 million, of course, on top of the 1.876 million reserve. Within AOTUS, there is a £29,000 overspend, and the point that I want to highlight here really is on the travel side and how expensive it has become over the past 2 years for pupils travelling up and down the country to access education. This has been a real cost driver, and that's not just for the DSG, that is on the council side, particularly because it is the council side that funds the majority of the SEN transport as well as the mainstream home school. However, DSG does pay for AOTUS related travel for pupils and inclusion related travel, which have both seen overspends and continue to require growth in these areas. It was sort of offset by, again, some staffing vacancies and some facility hire within the budget that was not used. It does look very similar to this year as well. Staffing vacancies against low incidence and high incidence needs teams throughout the year make up £144,000 of underspend on that side. Again, those vacancies have now been appointed to, so they cannot be relied upon in future years to bring down any deficits. Independent school budgets overspent by 676,000. I think this is sort of in ties with the next two bullet points, where we've got 2.137 million overspend on top-ups and £200,000 overspend on notional payments. We have seen, again, this should be no surprise, 30% growth in EHCPs year on year, which outstrips any budgets that we've set aside. We do continue to see growth on EHCPs, and as a national trend, there is this high level of growth, which is the main driver for overspends on the high needs block, as you would imagine. Education, welfare, central services, again, the underspend is generally because of staff and vacancies part-time throughout the year. And you can see there on the inclusion budget that I've included the £164,000 transport overspend. It is offset again by underspending an alternate provision, and we're able to keep more children essentially within inclusion within the PRU, rather than using alternate provision wherever possible. The schools block was underspent by 746 million. Two of these items are subject to request from Schools Forum to carry forward into 24-25. One is the £126,000 trade union time balance. You can see the attached documentation in Appendix A for the justification of what that will be spent on, what that is needed for, and the same for English as an additional language, carrying forward a £75,000 balance. The school contingency was not spent this year of £321,000. It will roll over and it is essentially earmarked for anything regarding the redevelopments where we're paying, where we might have to pick up any sort of additional payments or closing schools balances and pay protection and that sort of thing. In summary conclusion, we can see the overall position where we have come into the year with 4.5 million and left the year with 1.159 million. You can see the individual positions and you can see the current forecast for 24-25, particularly pertinent in the high needs block overspend in year of £6.5 million, thus generating an end of year position estimated for the high needs block of 8.4 million and total DSG overspend of around £5.5 million. The graph below shows the overall position where we can see over the 4-year period a relatively stable schools block, central schools block and early years block. Despite the growth in early years, there's a lot of extra funding, there's a lot of extra requirements on early years, but we are forecasting for that to remain steady, and you can see the pull that the high needs block ultimately has on the overall position. There are significant underspends throughout the year that I've just gone through, most of which relate to staffing. Okay. These positions are filled or will be filled and are forecast to be filled over the year and therefore can't be reliant as recurrent underspends to pin down any budgets. Now the surplus on historic commitments, so this is on pensions, essentially, on enhanced pensions and on the RCCO, the revenue to capital transfer, to cover, we had to cover of £250,000 every year. That has now come to an end. Now, the funding does tailor with that from the DFE, so we kind of have 1 year where we'll have a little bit extra in that area, but then it will go back to normal, and that has been built into the budget. The school's contingency cannot be relied on as we are going through significant redevelopments through Northumberland, and it will be required in those redevelopments. At the moment, that overall position includes a significant schools contingency. So once we do start using that pot, you will see again a dramatic drop in the overall position on the DSG. As if it needs any more discussion, we can see there that it's the rapid growth in the high needs block, and 3.723 million is the overall sort of in-year overspend if you take out the reserve position. If you then take out the transfer from the schools block to the high needs block, we're talking about an in-year overspend of £4.2 million for 23-24. Largely unsustainable growth and unsustainable spend. We've known about the pressure for a few years in terms of we first saw it coming out of COVID in 21-22, and it's been exponentially worse since that point. The intention going forward is to continue the reporting in this manner and to keep the blocks separate so that we can continue to sort of focus and forecast on the individual blocks. And whilst the high needs block may be overspending and that draws all the attention, we obviously want to keep scrutiny, particularly on early years block, as we see early years growth. So that is the intention going forward.
Thank you, Callum. Before we go to the recommendation, are there any questions you want to ask for Callum's report from the floor? Yes, Keith.
The surplus on the facility time, is that surplus available to the general school budget, or is it ring-fenced to the facility time budget?
It's ring-fenced within AOTUS. It was for hiring out venues, essentially.
Trade union facility.
Oh, sorry, the trade union.
And that's the request coming forward to ring fence that forward for future work.
Well, what I'm getting at is that I used to be a trades union representative in Public Health England, and I was the only trades union rep who actually put down facility time. So to me, it's what I'm really getting at is it seems to me to be just like something that's added onto the budget and is never really going to be spent.
I think obviously there are specific issues arising from reorganisation which may draw on it. Christina, is anything you'd like to pick up in relation to that?
So the way that the trade union facility time budget works is that each individual school who buys in makes a contribution. We've managed to increase the number of schools buying in, so therefore increase the overall balance. Trade union colleagues over COVID have lost some active officers, and we're busy working with the trade unions now to bring back active officers who support schools. Obviously, there are some things that are coming up that we know that will involve more trade union time. So what we are doing is we are helping the trade unions at this current moment time to spend. We've got quite a lot of invoices to come through, which will use that, because although the income stream comes in from April to March, the actual formal arrangements with the trade unions for release time comes in from August to September. So you will see some, that's right, September to August, I did that the wrong way around. So you will see that come through. Also, we've got, I suppose, an age profile within our trade union colleagues. So we're busy working with them to make sure that when some of the colleagues step away from the role, we've got smooth transition. So the intention is that we continue to monitor the balance this year. Going into next year, we continue to monitor the balance and support the trade unions to keep the volume and the capacity that they need. And then thereafter, if we still had money that we couldn't spend, then there would be a conversation within Forum about either a reduction in the per pupil charge in that year, and that would ultimately mean a refund to schools. So we are monitoring, watching it, but we are also conscious that we gained a little bit of those credits over COVID because staff weren't coming out of school, they weren't on release time, there were limited charges, so we have carried forward a little bit, but the intention is to continue to work with the trade unions so we're not carrying a surplus, and we continue to support well those schools that buy in to the trade union facility time.
Thank you. You wanted a question?
Yeah, it's just really about the, and I think I probably know the answer, well, I do know the answer to it, but we're not in a different position with regards to the forecast deficits from any other local authority. Is that correct?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Northumberland hasn't yet. There are two keynote DFE programmes in relation to that. The safety valve programme, which is additional funding attached, but with conditions attached to that, which, you know, again, a number of other North East authorities are in. And then there's a wider Delivering Better Value in SEND programme. We haven't hit the radar of any of those yet, but obviously that's triggered some of the discussions we've had both at High Needs Block and Schools Forum about subsequent sort of action to be taken in line with obviously the further presentation this morning.
Yeah.
It's a national issue, but it's still an issue for Northumberland.
Yes, it is indeed. Thank you.
I would just add to that. Sorry, Bruce. The LA7 have recently met. And we have forecast all the positions across the 7, and it's remarkably, our position is remarkably similar going forward to Newcastle in particular, but as to the group and as a whole, there is a paper going forward to government outlining the position, outlining how we are all forecasting the same thing, and there is clearly a fundamental funding gap.
Yes.
Just two questions really. Just really looking for assurances from the forum in particular. In terms of obviously staff vacancies has been an underspend and a saving. I'm sure colleagues in the room managing budgets right now know in terms of restructure and redundancies that happen in schools. Can we have some assurance that that's also been looked at this level in terms of if there's been staff and vacancies and now they've been filled, that could have been a saving? And, you know, are staffing levels correct over all the teams?
That's yes, David, yes.
Yeah, we specifically from a high needs block perspective, there are some of those vacancies continue to be vacancies. One of the approach is that we have to minimise spend full stop, and the pain definitely needs to be shared collectively. At some of the workshops that we had when we were looking at high needs block spend, there wasn't any call. There was limited calls, sorry, for a reduction in the central teams, because that knock on the central. There's a lot of people saying that not in every case, but in a lot of cases saying that they rely on the central team, and actually the input from those teams reduces school spend and reduces high needs block demand and so on. So there's that balance to try and get right. But as far as we're concerned, right across the council, and certainly within high needs block spend, is that where there are vacancies that we've worked with the finance team to maintain the posts, but we are not filling them. So they do appear in the structures, and therefore there is currently a spend allocated to them for this year, but I could reel off 4 or 5 posts which are currently in a pause position, and we won't be coming back to that in order to fill them and spend the money. So some, maybe not all, but some of the underspends from this year will continue.
And then just the second question is around that transport issue. You know, we know we're in Northumberland. We know Northumberland's vast. Northumberland's always been vast. There's £310,000 overspend just in the high needs block alone. That's also just a small part of the overall budget. Are there any plans to look at transport across Northumberland for this area in terms of allocated pooled transport, anything in order to bring that cost down?
So there's currently a best value for money review going on across all transport. We have a number of schemes, pilot schemes currently ongoing that will, because of the split of the budget, it is mostly hit by the council. It's a very small percentage of the budget that comes out of DSG, but it is being looked at specifically actually for AOTUS on how they can operate differently, on how they can work with providers to reduce that overspend going forward. That is very much sort of in the eye at the moment. So yes, I do raise it on here, raise it for that purpose, just to make sure that everybody's aware, but also to make sure everybody's aware that there is a value for money programme going on that is looking specifically at it.
And from our point of view, in terms of permanently excluded young people, we are piloting a new scheme from September that will probably see around 50% of our current cohort getting bus passes instead of taxis, and therefore encouraging that independent travel as well. So we are looking to do that from September. Again, that's really important for us because we're going to have the largest cohort we have ever had in alternative provision starting this September, with around 250 children in alternative provision starting the term. And I think when I took over responsibility for the service, I think we were probably down to the low 40s that we would start the term. So that is a significant. So whilst you won't not realise the impact, and it will still potentially be an overspend, it could have been much worse perhaps if we hadn't have put these processes in place. So the team are busy, and they're going to get independent travel training during the summer as well. So with our alternative providers and a couple of posts that we've created as part of the best value review, we'll be supporting some of those children. But just to reassure you as well, those children have obviously all been assessed, risk assessed. Not everyone is going to get a bus pass. It will absolutely depend on their individual circumstances. But we're hopeful, you know, that encouragement of that independent travel, both in school time and outside of school time, will encourage more to take that offer up as well. Okay.
And Mike
I was just going to answer the first part of that question. It's kind of the other half of the first part of the question that you had around the central teams as well. So the high incidence needs team in particular have had over 200% increase in demand. In one of their teams, over 400% increase in demand. We've changed the ways of working which people will recognise in schools. That's been really effective this year, which means that to meet that demand, we've been able to meet that demand with the same number of colleagues on site. So that's, I know it's not necessarily a saving, but it's a maintaining of the same spend to increase demand. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Dave, please.
Yeah, and just to reiterate again with the school transport, there's been a report all the way through to Cabinet. I think there's 36 recommendations for improvements within cost effectiveness for school transport or managing growth. A number of them have just been mentioned and they are underway, and actually But I think you asked about whether how it was being prioritised. It's right at the top table in terms of an area for development, and the report's really sound. It's just actioning the 36 points and then ensuring that they do have the outcomes that are expected by those 36 points, which is the other thing as well.
Any further questions? No. Well, we'll go to what we call the recommendations. First one, approved to carry out the 2023-24 trade union facility surplus in line with request in Appendix A. Do you agree, Forum, to carry this over? Yeah, all agree? Yeah, that's very good, because as a trade union officer for Northumberland County Council for retired members, I keep on bringing this up at my branch meeting. Why haven't we got a trade union officer from Unison like we used to have on it? And like that. So I shall bring it up again yet on Monday when I'm at the meeting, saying, you know, you had no excuse, you were told about this meeting, you should be here today. Right, so next one, approve and carry forward the English as additional language one. Do you agree? Okay. Right, so that's the end of that part of there, yeah. Thank you, Callum, for your report and everything like that. Item 6. Item 7, rather. Sue, it's over to you, I believe, yes?
It is, thank you, Graham. Yeah, I think this is a bit of an early warnings report, actually, that I wanted to put in place today, just to remind forum members that as part of the setting of the DSG that Callum's already covered, is, you know, since 2017 we have been building up a reserve in our contingency fund around school reorganisations. So not only where buildings happen, but where school closures come from a various means, whether that's whole school reorganisation or individual closures. And you'll be aware we've, you know, since 2017 we've had a number of those come through to our cabinet for decision. So what we have done again in the background there is just to identify that currently we've built up a contingency fund of £1.3 million, a further 325,000 I think going into the pot this year. But I think, as agreed back in 2017, that we would bring back reports into Schools Forum so that when we were spending that contingency, members were fully aware of where that money was being spent and how that was supporting school budgets as we go through a closure process. So really this report today sets out a bit of a timeline around when we'll be able to come back into Schools Forum to report how we've been able to support predominantly the ongoing employment of our staff within closing schools. Because again, you know, on the record yet again, many times I've said before, when we do school reorganisations, it's not about the quality of teaching and learning in schools, particularly our middle schools as they are closing now. And the idea is that we retain those good and outstanding teachers through that transition and that reorganisation, and therefore looking to use the contingency to support that ongoing employment for staff, rather than making them redundant, but in effect providing some support for their salary protection by the employing school as we move forward. I can't give you an indication of what those numbers will look like. They're very individual to the individuals and their particular circumstances. What this report really just sets out is to warn you that there will be a draw on that fund moving forward, because the number of staff that we will have at risk, both in the COCUT partnership in Amble and the Berwick partnership as we move through reorganisation. Again, we're asking you to note that we will bring another report back into Schools Forum for the 2 partnership changes. So bringing the outcome for the COCUT reorganisation in the financial year 25-26 and for the Berwick reorganisation in the year 26-27. More than happy to bring some interim reports or as we're moving through the detail and the process of redeploying staff. Again, in COCUT, we'll be looking to do the next round of interviews probably in October, November time, and in September, October for the Berwick partnership. So we'll have a greater indication of those staff that haven't been successful in their redeployment in the initial phases. But just to say that the protocol, the staffing protocol I talk about in the report remains in place for the duration of the reorganisation, and therefore any posts that become vacant within those schools in the partnerships would be advertised, and those staff will get a preferential interview as we actually move forward through that change process. I think going back to a little bit about where Christina's point around facility time, you will be aware that we've obviously had an industrial dispute in the Berwick partnership, and therefore have continued to work with our trade union colleagues and met with them at least once a week, sometimes twice a week over the last month. So that carry forward would be essential to supporting that. And on those terms, obviously, the last 2 days of strike action have been called off. We've made some significant progress with the unions, but using the use of this contingency to support their members' ongoing employment is absolutely essential to the ongoing teaching and learning, particularly for our children in the Berwick partnership. So I think we're asking for continued support, I think, from Schools Forum for the use of this fund as we actually move forward.
Thank you, Sue. Any questions for Sue?
The amount that comes into the contingency fund, is that just taken from retained schools, balances within the schools block?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Graham, that everybody, it's a direct contingency from maintained schools. The schools that are impacted by this change are all maintained schools, although we have got an academy that is creating vacancies for staff. So we would look to protect the staff in maintained schools, although there would be a potential positive impact on the budget of Berwick Academy. Okay.
Any further questions? Sue, thank you for your report. If you can keep the forum updated in the Berwick and the COCUT thing, anything major coming up in the coming year would be very useful. Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask another question?
Yes, certainly, Graham.
Just understand, are there any precedents being set that potentially could be problematic down the line, or not? Would it be looked at case by case in the future? And I understand pragmatically in terms of, for example, salary safeguarding, but would that then be potentially baked in for the future, and could that be problematic?
No, I don't consider so, Graham, because staffing protocols are individual to each partnership as it actually changes. All that the staffing protocol does is recognise existing arrangements around salary protection and safeguarding. I think, again, as I've said in the report, it's something that we've done for the last 18 years in Northumberland when we've done reorganisation. I think the way that schools are funded and the changes in those arrangements has meant that we've needed to create the contingency fund to continue to support those staff at risk and school budgets as we move forward. The regulations, though, only allow us to do that top slicing from maintained schools, as you've already said. So I think we would reflect if there are significant changes and we weren't able to keep a contingency moving forward, then we would need to look at that again. But hopefully with these next 2 rounds of reorganisation, there should be enough funding in the pot to support the work that needs to happen to secure that ongoing employment for the staff.
Yeah, just a final thought. I can see it makes absolute sense in this case, and I'm representing the academy, so I've got a muted voice, but I'm thinking in the future, as potentially there's more academisation, and then if there's reorganisation in the future, that there's just a risk that there's a bit of a hybrid that doesn't kind of sit that comfortably, because academies wouldn't necessarily have the scope to safeguard salaries in the way that's been proposed here. So it's just avoiding potentially a problem down the line, or being aware of a potential problem down the line.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's why, you know, the staffing protocol that we have in each of the partnerships is bespoke and would take that into consideration. And as you know, it's a voluntary agreement, a staffing protocol. Although a collective agreement that everybody can agree, and there will be compromises within any agreement. And I think, you know, as we move, you know, if we move into other partnerships, you know, it's for those partnerships to agree and discuss about that fair and equitable support for those staff at risk. Okay.
Right, thank you, Sue, for that. Okay, then we'll move on to item 8, maintaining school balance on the 31st of March 2023. That's you, Bruce, I believe.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. Again, a brief sort of state of the nation or state of the county schools anyway in terms of overall balances, in terms of background, you know, and again, there's clear links here with the subsequent agenda item on the scheme for financing schools. If any school is in a fortunate enough position to carry forward more than 16% of its DSG budget share, or 10% for high schools, they need to submit a spending plan in relation to that to colleagues in corporate finance, sort of overseen by Callum. You know, again, that still applies to some schools, but and again, we're working through that process so as we speak at the moment, assessing that position. You know, again, I've been at Northumberland for 7 years now, and I can't think of a circumstance where we've actually taken excess balances back off schools. And it's certainly not been the position over the last few years, where we've seen a modest decline in the aggregate balances held by schools, and that's what we report in section 4 of the report. The reported balances at this point last year was 8.652 million. What we always do at this point is adjust the balances for any schools that have academised during the course of the year. So they've been adjusted by, again, 676,000. There still remains 100 maintained schools, and of those schools that were maintained throughout the course of the financial year 23-24, overall balances fell by £86,000, which is bracket 1.1%, not 91.1%, I'm pleased to report. Apologies for that. From just under £8 million to £7.9 million. Again, as lies damn lies and statistics, that can mask significant differences between schools. We go on to look at that on a phase-by-phase basis, but again, this has been my mantra previously, you know, the fundamental basic is around pupil numbers and maintaining those. As we can see in terms of the table there as part of 4, it's probably worth highlighting that the specific phase which has had the most significant downturn in aggregated balances during the year is our special schools. Again, there may be a number of individual reasons for that, but something we've highlighted previously was the fact that obviously special schools employ a higher percentage of teaching assistants and high-level teaching assistants. While there was some support, direct support from the DFE last year for the Teachers' Pay Award, although it wasn't fully funded, as forum members know, the impact of the NGSC agreement with the lump sum towards the bottom end of that meant that essentially for those staff around the bottom of the scale, we're looking at pay increases between 8 and 10%. Typically, these would be potentially teaching assistants, and it's had a more significant impact on that basis in terms of special schools. I think probably Andrew would support that. So that's why there is a significant decrease in balances approaching £600,000 in terms of special schools. Other than that, again, the largest number of schools numerically is first and primary schools, and we see a positive change of £612,000, less so in the smaller cohorts we have at middle and secondary. Again, just expanding that analysis, you know, we've got 77% of first and primary schools with a surplus or positive balance. Clearly, there's a lot of work goes on in terms of looking at the other 23% where we haven't where there is a deficit balance currently, to look to see how schools can return to a balanced budget position. But again, there's ongoing work on a medium-term financial plan basis around all the schools, with a specific group looking at those schools in significant deficits or specifically at risk. Again, although we've reported that the balances overall fell for our middle schools, they all continue to hold surplus balances currently. 4 of the schools saw a decrease in balances, 3 saw an increase during the 23-24 financial year. Again, very small cohort with the high schools, but 2 out of the 3 have a surplus balance. And then the special schools we've already noted. Again, just emphasising that word of caution. You know, again, we can discuss schools in phases as cohorts, but each school has its own specific circumstances. Whereas historically, possibly going back 4 or 5 years, and I have been asked about it this morning, we don't at this point publish the names of individual schools and individual school balances at this point in time. Clearly, individual schools are aware of their own balances, and we're doing a lot of work with them in terms of, you know, through corporate finance as well. That information is publicly available through the school's financial benchmarking service, and is generally made available for both maintained schools and academies around December each year. So if anybody is particularly interested in any individual school balances, that's where I would point them in the direction of. And clearly there is a link in the report below. The latest information held for both maintained schools and academies will still be based on 22-23 year end though at that point. Okay.
Okay. Any questions for Bruce?
The table there.
Well, you're having an easy time there, Bruce.
It's never an easy time with school funding, Graham.
I know, right. Right, well, okay, then we'll move on to the item 9, high needs, about suggestion thing. I'm sorry I wasn't in the last high needs meeting. I was stuck in school appeals down in, I think, in North Tyneside on 4 or 5 days on that, so I obviously couldn't get out of being chairing those. So, David, over to you. I believe it's the presentation, yeah?
There is, yeah. Clicker.
Oh, sorry, you want the clicker. There's the clicker.
Down.
Yeah. I think some of you may have seen this, so I'm sorry it's going to be repeated,
Yeah.
but... yeah.
Yeah, morning everybody. Good to see you as ever. I'll put my microphone on soon. I'm acutely aware that some of you may have seen some of these slides before, either at a range of consultation meetings. You might have seen some of the slides at the SENCO conference, or certainly those that attended the subcommittee there of the high needs block. We'll also have seen some of these slides, but also to indicate that through following each and every one of the consultations, this has been tweaked, sometimes significantly, sometimes less so. So the presentation currently is a combination of a number of meetings and discussions that have gone on in the background. And even though some of the messages we've been reiterating today have possibly felt a bit grim at the time, and the concerns about overspends, particularly in the high needs block, I do want to just highlight that SEND there are also multiple areas of SEND operation in Northumberland that are a massive success story. So the fact that, I'll bullet point some of them, but just the real headlines, the collective system is meeting the needs of twice as many learners as it used to. That is a significant success. The fact that mainly schools, but schools, settings, alternative providers, independent sector, officers, central teams collectively have been able to deliver for this number of learners and with a higher degree of need is a massive success. We have some challenges around finances going forwards, but actually other local authorities and other county councils have been in this situation multiple years before we are. IC and our school reviews all demonstrate that we have the highest degree of exclusive practice ever in Northumberland. In the last 250 Ofsted reports, we've only had one comment that was neutral on SEND. So it wasn't even that negative a comment. 250 reports, one comment. And if we think about the bar that is held by Ofsted, I think that is a significant success. We've got the most dedicated, skilled and empowered workforce ever. They might be all shattered at the end of this term and are in other terms and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we shouldn't underplay their dedication, their skill and their knowledge and their empowered position that they're in. Mentioned before, meeting the needs of the more learners. I think that is the most dramatic thing, and their families, though we probably are collectively and individually sometimes involved in complaints or queries from certain families that are questioning. Actually, against the 3,700 plans or whatever we've got in place, the complaints element is a tiny fraction. And yourselves will be on parents' evenings, on the playground, on getting feedback from families whose children have got a degree of SEND, sometimes quite a high degree of SEND, sometimes low degree of SEND, who are absolutely thrilled with the provision. We are meeting need, massive amounts of need on a regular basis on a budget that's sat still. It is a success. More complex needs than before. Meeting the needs of the communities and closer to home as well. The range and ability and flexibility within schools, I would say, and is also replicated both by Ofsted and in our school improvement reports, is that there is much more differentiated curriculum deliveries, some real areas of best practice which we need to shine a light on as well within that. And in terms of adulthood, preparing for adulthood and employment, it's been a little bit of an Achilles heel possibly in terms of outcomes, but we're seeing some more than just green shoots, but a real, for example, extension in our skills provision post-16, which is enabling a number of young people with special educational needs who might have gone on to be NEET otherwise, going on to supported internships and will be going on to gainful employment. Some huge amounts of success there, driven by all the providers. Back to the budget. This is a breakdown 23-24. Some of it's been highlighted by Callum already and by Abigail Russell in previous meetings. Just a breakdown of what happened last year, just so you can see the proportions. It is where it is. The change, though. So just some bullet points that highlight the change. The growth in EHCPs, it's been 99% growth in the last 4 years. At time of taking this data, I think Callum's report had this year alone at 30%, Callum. So there's the indication of where we are. That growth is, following the SEND2 data that came out just recently, it's the 11th highest area of growth out of 152 local authorities. So just to try and put us into a context. And through that time period, the value of the top-ups has increased from 13 million to 20 million. It's reflective of the growth. I don't say. Special school growth, 11% annually. So over this 4-year period, it is 44% growth in the number of special school places in Northumberland. That's slightly flavoured a little bit by some of the early delivery of the specialist support bases, but not all of the specialist support bases are included in that figure yet. But it's something that might become an element going forwards. The high needs block itself has grown, so that's been obviously very welcome, that the income coming in has grown at the same time. It's grown 50%, which is a significant grant growth, actually. That doesn't take into account inflation. Inflation over that period of time is 30% and compounded probably closer to 35%. But growth in the high needs block it has been significant and very welcomed. But obviously there's a gap. The demand is 49% higher than the funding before inflation. If you want to throw inflation in, you know, it's an 80% gap in the funding to where we were. And I don't ever remember us being that flush before either. Do you know what I mean? It's not that 4 years ago there was money for every need and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've always been having quite a tight belt approach needed around high needs block. Again, just to reiterate, Callum's already mentioned it. So high needs block, last year's in-year deficit was 3.7 million. We had some contingency funds that went in, so the final balance was minus 1.8. With some conservative, with a small c, estimates of growth going forward, so not modelling the growth we've already had, modelling a curtailment in growth. It looks like this year, we're currently a significant way through it, but this financial year, 6.5 million, we don't have the contingency that we did have. So probably looking at next April, 8.3 million final balance on the high needs block. And that's 15% of the grand total. A lot of people have talked about doing things differently. You know, we are all statutorily and morally bound to meeting need. But against this financial backdrop, through no fault of anybody, it's not a fault, it's just a situation and a scenario that we're in. We will have to, we are and have been, need to continue to look at doing things differently and thinking differently about provision. We have to meet need. So, you know, that's a non-negotiable. It doesn't matter. How do we square the circle? Why is there isn't? If there was a silver bullet, it would have been taken already. If there's those local authorities that have already been massively overspent or involved in the safety valve programme, if the safety valve programme had the silver bullet answers, I'm sure it would be being communicated. We would have picked that up and would be employing it ourselves. But we'll see how that progresses. But no silver bullet. But things are we're going to need to try and approach things differently. So, just looking at it from an accountancy perspective, so not really real life. I'll build some real life into it as we go on. But what are the things that have caused the deficit? Where is the spend going? Where, you know, 2 years ago we had a balance, now we don't. What's the difference between the two positions? And it's pretty clear, actually. This bit is a little bit more silver bullet-y in terms of what they're doing. So, transport costs, sometimes in the inclusion team or EOTAS or those sorts of sides to it, have caused increased spend. And also, there is a correlation, actually, between the amount of distance you travel and the overall cost. So not just the travel cost. This isn't just about buses. But actually, some of our learners, maybe with the highest degree of need, so there is an element of that, but who travel furthest, also travel to placements that are more expensive. So there is a double win if we can collectively, or not collectively, but if we can get to a position where learners have their needs met closer to home. Initially you think, oh great, transport saving, but actually across the whole piece, the stuff that's nearer to you, or the locations that are nearer to you, are actually, I'm going to use this word very advisedly, I'll use to say more efficient or more effective use. I was going to say are cheaper. They're not cheaper, they're great provisions, and we need to support those. So the more we can support provisions nearer to the learner, the indication is that will be saving both on transport as a small part, but more collectively in terms of more cost-effective solutions in the local community. The second bit, where the growth clearly has led to some significant increase in spend, is in the number of EHCPs. That's not the whole SEND picture, but I think it's indicative of the SEND picture. So that's the 99% growth figure in the last 4 years, 30% growth in the last year. Obviously, that particular area. If there were, and I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing or how difficult it'd be or not, But if there were more, if some of those learners stayed on SEND support, the extra expenditure would not have come about. I'm not making a value judgment about whether they should or whether they shouldn't. And there could be a degree of discussion that's around actually having an EHCP earlier might, that earlier identification of need and addressing of that need might actually mean that there was less sort of falling off a cliff scenarios at an older age. And I think there's some merit, probably there is some merit in that as well. Back to the financial position of that though, so recognition of need, and then I suppose what work can be or should be done in order to recognise what resource needs to come with that. And there's some of that in some of the options coming up. But certainly look at EHCP practice. We weren't as close to some of the national averages in terms of COSA applications, COSA turndowns and bits and pieces like that. But actually this year we are becoming much closer to national averages in that respect. But we do have a higher proportion of our EHCP learners in special schools than in mainstream. And again, I'm not making a value judgment on that. I'm just saying that that is the case when compared to the national average. That could be because all of those learners absolutely need that specialist provision, and that's where that could well be the case. But a little bit of a step away. A lot of Northumberland's metrics in terms of health, salaries, those sorts of outside influences on SEND and equalities, I suppose, as a whole, we are pretty much, free school meal figures, we are pretty much in line with the national average. So if there are any collective measures in other areas, why would we be out of line with the national average in there? There could be good reasons for that. I'm not making a judgment on that. But as we are lots of key metrics from health and economy, we are at the national average. So you'd expect us to be at the national average in other measures as well. Or maybe not, because our geography is different and that might have good influence. And the last one is associated with the EHCPs and the number of them, but also the overall cost of top-up values. So I'm not suggesting this, and it wasn't suggested by anybody at any of our extensive consultations, but the schools forum could solve the high needs block gap and just reverse all top-up payments to 4 years ago. Because 4 years ago it was a 13 million spend. Now it's a 21 million spend. If you just reduced all those top-ups back to where they were, you would save £6.5, £7 million in the budget, and we'd have a balance at the end of the year. I'm not suggesting that because but there are other local authorities. So Newcastle, which is in a very similar position to us actually, they're currently having discussions with School Forum and consultations with schools about a blanket. I think they're going on a 5% cut in all top-ups, but they are talking cuts at a time when growth is exceptional. It is being discussed in other local authorities around that area, open-handedly, I think, and without enforcement at this particular point in time. But those are the areas, from an accountancy perspective, you would probably want to look at. There is the knock-on of unintended consequences, which I think is exactly what Nicola was mentioning there, is if there was a set of suggestions made by a forum which were about cuts or reductions in funding, then if that had a knock-on effect in terms of difficulties in provision and therefore exclusions, and then in trying to meet our statutory requirements around that, there could be that a saving suggestion goes on to actually cost more than it saves. And there is a really fine line, I think, for Forum to consider in and around that. The other side, which would be exceptionally useful and that we haven't had, it's too early really to have any feedback from new government, but whether there is some possibility of increasing income into the pot and therefore meeting that. That would be obviously a great solution and the most appropriate solution. I'm not sure if any of us would necessarily want to wait for that to happen. But if we prepare for a certain set of scenarios and it turns out to be not as bad as that, then I don't think we'll have any problem sort of expanding provision or expanding resource at that point in time. Okay, so then, I've got 3 slides which basically go through the 3 that are there. Those are the areas where the growth has been. That's where the extra cost has been spent. So can we impact on any of that without causing the increase in exclusions, etc., or you know, significant stresses in the system which lead to other unintended consequences. So in terms of meeting needs as close to home as possible, some of these suggest to have a monetary value, and I've got a slide later on which makes some assumptions and estimates some monetary values. But all of these suggestions here are based on a certain thought process which is around not cutting. So if you try and think about each of these as being schools keep what they've got, it's the growth which has led to the deficit. So we're trying to curtail growth, not, as I said, Newcastle, I believe are suggesting, which is actually cutting the funding going directly to schools. But if we can stop or control some of the growth areas, and then over time, as the high needs block incrementally grows each year, look to see if our deficit can be diminished in that way, rather than making cuts which then lead to a gap in provision and then possibly an increase in spending, exclusions and that side. Very fine line, I appreciate. Okay, so support all schools to deliver ordinarily available provision. 18 months ago, ordinarily available provisions, a document that was shared with schools. Some of the content within the ordinary available provision document was a bit scary for some schools. I think collectively schools felt that was a standard they wished to work towards and wished to deliver on, but also some schools recognised that they needed some additional support or resources in order to deliver that. But I think in terms of meeting needs as close to home as possible, this is the cornerstone, and a reiteration from Forum about that as an expectation, with support, but as an expectation, I think could be useful in us having the needs met of more learners closer to home and the associated decrease in growth in expensive further away placements. Develop further specialist training and support in mainstream schools. Actually could be in special schools as well, to be fair, but certainly there has been some extensive developments in terms of the training and support that's available. I think some of the, as an example, we've had 3, 4, 5 conferences now looking at different areas of SEND provision. It's been massively well supported by schools, and I think seen some significant developments in terms of operation within schools, but also a lot of the central teams offering training to schools and to partnerships, trusts, alliances in the future, clearly is a no-brainer really in terms of moving forwards, and has had a positive impact on enabling us to do that high-level provision now, even though we've got twice as many learners. Further reduce out-of-county placements by increasing highest need capacity in Northumberland special schools. All the special schools have, in the last 12 months, maybe accepted and working well with learners that might be outside of their usual designations. And they've done that to try and meet need as close to home as possible. Sometimes that's been developed around bespoke packages, which on the face of it might seem expensive, but they are delivering stuff outside of their normal delivery model, or very bespoke curriculum. But actually, if the knock-on effect is that now means that money isn't going to an independent sector place, which I had 2 problems with. Sometimes it's not as high a quality as our current special schools are, and they cost more money. So we get a worse provision for more money, and that's to be welcomed. But I think we need to build with that with the schools, build their confidence and the capacity to do that. Support, the specialist support basis in primary has been a successful pilot, and we've got, as we speak today, 108 learners who are accessing a specialist support base in their mainstream school who ordinarily would have gone on to be seeking a special school placement. So that's both enabled the special schools to have more capacity maybe for the higher end learners, the bullet point above, but also keeping that learner closer within their community. And so one of the recommendations you'll see later is continued support for specialist support bases and alternative provision models in the secondary sector. Across our secondary sector, we've got great deal of interest in supporting that. Some of our secondary colleagues are delivering now, and others want to deliver more and do things differently going forwards. And as an addition to that, I think we probably are in a position to have a look at post-16 SEND provision. And one of the recommendations is to look at a review of that. I don't know what that review would bring about. But again, if it enables possibly more capacity within the special school sector and or specialist post-16 provision that's closer to home, there are which lead directly to supported internships and productive employment and all that. I do think that there's possibly some area for work there. There's lots of good work going on in the area, but it's a bit isolated, and actually bringing that together into a proper review, I think could be constructive. And I also think that looking at partnership solutions, which is the driver of the SEND place planning capacity strategy, driven by Sue and the team, but it's looking at geographical solutions. How collectively can a group of schools meet the needs in this area for the next 5 years, as opposed to individual schools heading off in their particular direction. But the new alliances model will have 8 of those in September up and running. So again, 8 alliance solutions may well be a really high quality and also cost effective solution to the growth and the demand that we've got. Looking at EHC practice and being in line with national average, as I said, there are some areas where we're not quite so in line. Continue and extend appropriate challenge for COSA applications. We all know, and there is a strong line of argument which says parental demand is absolutely key. And that parental demand is absolutely supported within the code of practice. Whether the parents always demand appropriate provision, every parent needs support from professionals to support what the best next step is for their young person, and sometimes they go on to make decisions that maybe ultimately are not in the best interests of the young person, though they feel it might be at that point in time. So in supporting that, one of the things is in and around COSA and just ensuring that we apply the appropriate statutory guidance and that we bring ourselves in line with turn down rates and acceptance rates, of course, because I think that then reflects well on the overall spend. This is quite a significant suggestion and quite a change. So particularly at the workshops, where we discussed options for the high needs block, quite a lot of folk talked about there being the amount of school support available in school through the notional funding, and then at the other end, what an EHC plan and the resources that brings, and that there's a gap in the middle. So that possibly some folk who are at the edge of what's available and suitable around ordinarily available provision, and the first £6,000 spent by the school, end up, because the only route is to make the huge jump to EHCP, because there's nothing in the middle. And what that's done, I think, is where the EHCPs used to be at this far end of the spectrum, the bottom end of it has shrunk down, and that's been a driver for the growth in the EHCP applications. Not the only driver, but has been a driver. So there's been discussion about having something which fits in the middle, which would be Northumberland Education Support Plan, as an option possibly post-COSA, so still the same thresholds for application of COSA. We're not talking about a model where all SEND support learners get a Northumberland plan. That wouldn't be a cost-effective solution, but the needs are recognised. Parents can hang the hat on a recognition of need, which is formally done, but at the same time, it's something that we might be able to implement faster than a full HCP assessment, and we might also be able to free up some educational psychology time currently tied up in EHCP assessments, and delaying those possibly assessments for learners with the very highest levels of need, having more resource available at that particular point, because we've got something in the middle ground which is really appropriate, really effective, has some teeth, really clearly states what the needs of the learner are and supports the local school in delivering that. And though that might be a lot of that might be doing just best practice anyway, and we've got a gap in best practice because this thing doesn't exist at the moment, but actually one of the knock-on effects in terms of the funding arrangements is that it would be a nod towards some additional funding resources for the school, but probably on a lower average banding than a full EHCP assessment and all the resources required to do that. This has been done in a number of different local authorities, not many. There's been a couple where it's fallen on its face and hasn't worked, and I'm aware of the shortfalls, and probably in its application, we need to make sure we avoid some of the shortfalls that the local authorities have had. But there are a couple where it's been really quite successful, and so obviously we would build on that best practice should this be a recommendation to go ahead. Just a bit aware of time, and so I'll whiz through some of these. Manage the growth in top-up spending, the banding model. A lot of the workshops, people said the current banding model doesn't really make sense. It's a bit of a best guess. In fact, it's not even a best guess. It's a shot in the dark in terms of what the banding is and what it's applicable for and where it should be. So there is a suggestion some of this model was developed at the workshops live with practitioners who said, well, what if it looked like this and what if it looked like this? So one of the recommendations is that we do look at a new banding model and that we actually come back with that model, maybe loosely tied to what's recorded in this slide, but come back to Schools Forum and use some of our other, obviously, Senko networks, etc., to try and develop a policy and practice that might work better than the one we've got. Both in terms of meeting need and being more cost effective. There's a couple of challenging bullet points here. Again, Schools Forum may feel bound to take these steps or may not. You know, this is recommendations for you to consider. Future banding increase requests require a breakdown of the cost for the individual and the whole school. So we do have lots of individual breakdowns of costs currently requested for increased top-ups, which actually on paper are really legitimate. I can see that we can see the bespoke funding group who are considering those applications can see the school is spending a significant amount of money on a particular learner. But actually, with a better reflection on the whole school budget and a look at their current notional spend, if that's a school that's got 20 other learners with high degrees of need and their notional is being well spent across the board, or alternatively, it's a school that has one learner with high level of need and no draw on the rest of their notional spend, there's an unfairness in awarding the same amount of top-up to the same learners because one school's already exhausted its notional and is desperate for more, whereas another school has got a comfortable notional balance and having an exploration for that could be a way forward to see if the top-up is really is truly best allocation of the limited funds available. And we can put together some templates for that to make it as straightforward for schools as possible to demonstrate their financial position. And then another one on a similar note, and Bruce mentioned some of the school balances. School balances overall have been static, different in different sectors, but been static against inflation over the last 4 years of 30+%. So schools have clearly taken a lot of efficiency measures in order to support them, the provision over there. But is there a line of argument or a decision point to be made where revenue balances are picked 10% secondary and 16% primary, because that's the clawback area from ESFA recommendations, i.e. these are schools that are demonstrating they have a significant balance from an ESFA perspective. The school may not feel that that's excessive, and I think there would have to be some discussion in that case. But actually, if the awarding of a top-up, the impact of that is that a school with a balance of 16% maintains its balance of 16%, then the high needs block, has it been spent on that young person or not? if the other alternative was that their school receives no top-up, and the end of that financial year they end up with a balance of 14% instead of 16%, which is the one that's more appropriate going forward. There's 1,001 shades of grey in what I've just said. I've used a very specific example, but is that a thread which Schools Forum might feel should be considered when considerations are being made for top-up growth? Remember, there's nothing in these recommendations at the minute where I'm suggesting a cut in what schools currently receive. Schools keep what they've got. This is about growth, where there's requests for more, because it's the growth that's caused the deficit in a nutshell. There's a couple of bullet points here which are about payments to schools. This is paying schools slightly less. I'll be brutally honest on that, but it is a fraction, but could collectively save a significant amount. So if there was a discussion about increased top-ups, a couple of years ago, sometimes increased top-ups were asked for back payment, and I can see why, because the school had been providing that provision. As the financial situation has got more acute, there's almost no back payment of top-ups. It's from the day, or from the day the application is agreed, as it were, which some schools feel is unfair, but needs must. But actually, this is going a bit further than that, and it's saying if there was an agreement in October for an increase to top-up value, that actually that will be enacted on the 1st of January. It will be enacted at the start of the next term. It's a nibble at expenditure. That's all it is. Which stops some of the money going to schools, stops some of the top-up growth for a period of time. And the other one is additional notional. Currently, it's calculated at the end of each term and paid. Not every school receives additional notional, so this wouldn't be every school. But actually, if the additional notional calculation took place at the start of the term, there are less learners. The growth hasn't occurred, and there are less learners to pay at that point in time. So again, it saves a degree of spend from the high needs block, which hopefully, for some schools, in a painless way that they won't notice. For other schools, it will be noticeable, but not dramatically so. But it's a small change. Again, for your considerations. Increase income funding, this would be the killer. We could do nothing on the previous two slides if we could increase our funding. So currently for this financial year, Forum agreed a 0.5% transfer from schools block to high needs block. All of that money does still go to schools, but it goes to schools with the highest SEND needs, or the highest recognised SEND need. So there might be a difference there actually, but the highest recognised SEND need, you know, any money coming from schools block into high needs block, all of it goes back into, pretty much all of it goes back into schools, and certainly any increases certainly goes back into schools. But there was a point in time 6 or 7 years ago where there was we had a year when there was a 1% transfer. Schools Forum enacted that, and then with a viewpoint that the following year it was reduced to 0.75, 0.5, 0.25 was the lowest we've got in recent times, back to 0.5 for this financial year, already agreed. But in terms of increasing income going forwards, is there an argument for a 1%? It might be a 0.99% is within the Gift of School Forum. I think 1% might have to go to Secretary of State.
Anything above 0.5%.
Oh, anything above 0.5, all right. So it would have to go to Secretary of State anyway. I did have a slide once that said, or 1.5% or 2%. A lot of individual schools would say that would be well off the cards because of their current financial position. And I'm not arguing with that in any way, shape or form, but there could be a viewpoint that said school balances in some sectors have grown in the last 4 years. So there's a counterpoint to that. But whether there's a happy medium or a happiest medium for Pope and Vine. Gain more funding for support from the council. I was at SMT of the council a month ago, sharing a lot of these slides and demonstrating the position. Literally just been asked this morning by a leader of the council for a position paper. He wants to write a letter outlining the SEND position for Northumberland, and that's with a view to gaining more funds either from internal sources or from external sources. So it's very high on council priorities, and I will say that the council did put in, there was a bit of a service that was being funded from High Needs Block in previous years, whereas this financial year just gone, actually £886,000 a service was paid for out of pure council funds, which in previous years hadn't been. So our last year's balance could have been £886,000 lower again, actually. So there has been some input from council, real money, reducing spend on High Needs Block. But whether there's more, and I am an advocate of seeking more, just at this point in time can't guarantee more, and Schools Forum aren't in a position to demand more either, but it's there. Lobby central government, that's certainly ongoing. We've got, again, as an example, the National Audit Office asked if we would like a visit so they could come and go through High Needs Block, and also the findings from the most recent government green paper as to whether those actions were appropriate or not. And they sent me a list of questions, and they're asking absolutely the right questions. So I was quite pleased, at least that the spotlight's on there. We meet with DFE specifically around SEND. Finance is always a high proportion of that on a termly basis as well. That's more our regional northeast DFE colleagues. But the National Audit Office are coming to see us in September, and we'll be laying a similar message to this before them and looking for solutions. External funding streams. There are schools that do raise money outside of the normal funding streams, and some of our special schools in particular are very good at that. An added incentive, added bonus. And I forgot to mention one. There's the block of money that provides early years top up. It's not the same system, but the degree of early years top up is the SEND Inclusion Fund. It's a statutory function for the council to have. It's been partially funded by Early Years Block and partially funded by High Needs Block for years. The suggestion is that it's, as the Early Years Block is in balance and High Needs Block is not, that actually the progress going forwards is that the Early Years Block funds the entirety of the Inclusion Fund, which would mean High Needs Block is spending a tiniest proportion on our early years cohorts, which some people might think is, in principle, not the right thing, but needs must at this particular point in time, maybe. Okay, some figures. These are estimates about, we've got planned growth built into the budget. If the measures that I've suggested were all adopted and successful through the remainder of this financial year, we've managed to calculate some, it says savings, but it's a slowdown in the growth, and therefore a saving on this year's minus 6.5 million balance. You'll see that should they all be accounted for and come in, we're still only looking at a 3.7 million reduction in growth. It's the growth that's killing us. And then I've just tagged on the bottom because we've already included this year's 0.5% from Schools Block. If it was 1% next year, and Schools Forum recommended that will work towards that through the next period of time we've got, that would add in another 1.2 million, which for the next financial year, of course. So all the steps don't quite say enough, but is it a movement in the right direction? Is I suppose, a line of argument. And the recommendations are listed there. There's 10 of them. Some of them don't immediately lead to an immediate cut in growth, but enable the background steps to take place to continue this tight view. Some of them do directly lead to slowing down in growth in expenditure and have been calculated on the previous slide. Some of it's very simple in terms of agreement or not, because it's an agreement in principle or to principle. So it might be, it would be an effective step for the forum to become another advocate for ordinarily available provision, and have that as a mandatory baseline, but obviously with also a direction to officers to support schools to achieve that. Continue to look at and develop in-house SEND provision, so that SEND provision close to home. You know why that does ultimately save some money and produce high quality provision as well. Not easily, but does and has done that. Review the post-16 SEND position and consider new models. Again, that's an appropriate next step, which again immediately doesn't produce a huge saving, but whether going forwards it helps us develop the most cost-effective model in that area. The Northumberland Education SEND support plan, and the suggestion at the minute is, rather than introduce that whole scale for everybody in a 100% application and possibly fall down, trip at the first hurdle, to maybe limit that pilot to early years and Key Stage 1, where possibly there is the biggest gap between notional DHCP need at that point, and then should it be successful, then look to roll it into Key Stage 2 and possibly into Key Stage 3 and 4 in the future. Look for policy and practice of the banding system. I'm not expecting or asking for a recommendation that says the final solution for this, but if we want to be explored further, then we can develop a methodology for consideration by September forum, and also obviously consultation with schools as well, in and around that, in terms of developing and adjusting it. Certainly all head teacher groups, etc., we could run that by relatively swiftly. Consideration of whole school trust financial position, so looking at notional spend and balances, and that does refer to currently, this recommendation will be the 10%, 16%, but and that actually equates for 25% of schools. So 25% of schools are above that particular balance level. There is the worry that it would lead to schools to be profligate and throw money out the door, but actually I do have a confidence in the integrity of head teachers and governing bodies to continue to work as efficiently and effectively as possible on the whole, and therefore I'm not as worried about that, but I think it would be something that we need to share with any schools who didn't get a top-up value because of their balances. The payment timelines, again, nibbling at the edges. Inclusion fund, fully financed from the early years block, it's £200,000 saving straight away, but reduction in growth. That is a pure saving, actually. That's a pure saving. It's not a reduction in growth. And then look to increase schools block contribution 25-26. And obviously, we'd need to monitor report performance against these actions to forum at least termly. Those are the recommendations. Apologies for it taking quite a long time, but there is a lot in it.
Before we deal with any of the recommendations, any questions from the floor? Yes.
Yeah, I have one question. Well, one point really, and really from my role as a diocesan representative, which represents almost exclusively very small schools within Northumberland, is just to be very mindful of the disproportionate impact that some of those slowdowns in growth will have on the very small schools in comparison to the larger schools.
I think we always have small schools right up there in our priority list, and that changes the smaller the organisation, sometimes the tougher it is to battle through change. I completely recognise that. There might be some elements in there where the smaller school with a low balance and an obvious 200% spend on their notional, the procedures mentioned here would actually support the reason for an increased top-up for that particular school. So there are some elements in here which continue, as Schools Forum has over a number of years actually attempted to support the most inclusive schools. Lots of your actions have definitely directly done that. I think within most of these recommendations that core is still there, but there needs to be a case-by-case basis as well. It's one size doesn't fit all, hence the number of recommendations, I suppose.
David, if I can, I think the most recent example of that was obviously the additional notional payments we've made. And again, that was, you know, I've championed that, and that was been very much targeted towards those smaller, more inclusive.
And it's very, very welcome.
But again, over the last 2 years, the projected payments have increased from, you know, sort of 350,000 to over £1 million, which is one of the things. Again, we're not looking, as David said, we're not looking to cut it or withdraw it. I think there is a trade-off there for the greater certainty for heads getting the money at the start of the term, you know, offset against the fact, well, we might have getting additional funding for the mid-term admission. And, you know, again, I think that's the pragmatic trade-off as part of that, while we're still very much looking to promote and keep the scheme in principle.
Okay. Any further questions?
Well, I presume we're going to have the opportunity to go through each one and make observations in relation to those.
I mean, some of them, Graham, are very clear. We're waiting for officers' report and things like that. So, and you know, monitoring and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I'm very concerned as chair of High Needs coming back to forum and asking for a 0.5%, you know, out of the thing. As you know, when I took over the thing, I vowed that I wouldn't be coming back, and I have broken my promise of coming back each year to you. And I feel very sad, but I understand. You know, we're not the only authority that has the amount of children. Because I was doing school appeals in North Tyneside last week, and I couldn't be for a high school in there having 15 children coming into year 9 with educational care plans before even starting. It's a lot.
Do we want to go through the recommendations?
Well, if you would like to go through them and then see what
flavour is.
And then David, because obviously it's your report, I would rather you, and just say some of them we will not be able to deal with, we'll take them on board, but I think we need a further meeting of the High Needs Committee to actually look at 1 or 2 of these as well.
Yeah. That may well be the recommendation.
I would say, looking as chair, when I read some of these, was there. First time I actually sat down and looked at the recommendations.
So the first one's about ordinarily available provision. It's a document and a way of working which goes introduced 2 years ago. I think Mike might be able to keep me straight on that. I think some of the schools involved had been well consulted and knew it was coming, and some of the schools, some of it had slipped between the nets. So there was a sort of a relaunch at a slightly later date as well. But my understanding is that schools all aspire to that type of provision, but also we all do recognise that there are some schools that are on a journey towards delivering that. But it would be useful in terms of that meeting needs close to home as possible element of principle for Forum to be supportive of supporting schools towards that position. I know it's something that's cropped up at Education Strategy Board in the past and also at SEND Board. SEND Board, unsurprisingly, are absolutely advocating ordinarily available provision document as it sounds. And there is a redraft, Mike, just not an ultimate massive change, but just some further clarification and support to schools.
Some new areas that tackle some of the specific areas of growth at the moment as well. So things like emotionally based school non-attendance and that sort of thing. But there'll be opportunity to engage in that development work in the new term, not this term.
So when will that report come out then, Mike?
The aim is that that's ready by Christmas. So there'll be an autumn term engagement with parents and carers, with schools, SENCOs, senior leaders and colleagues in the local authority.
So shall we wait for that full report to come out before we make a decision on
There is the current ordinarily available provision exists as well, so it's already in existence, but it'll be updated.
Okay.
I think that's more about standardising.
Okay, right. So shall we take this recommendation on the first part?
Can I just say, because it was controversial when it came in, it laid out what I think ultimately were accepted as unrealistic expectations on schools, and it has been adjusted, but not everyone in forum will necessarily be aware of the detail, and Mike's suggesting there'll be further changes. So I think in principle, as a forum, I think we should take on trust Mike, who is leaving, I understand, but certainly him saying it's appropriate, and therefore we base our decision on that. I think we should also caveat it that further changes, we need to have some way of engaging with the feedback and kind of not being advocates for something that maybe Senkos and schools can't support. So I think in principle, yes, we take what Mike's saying because we don't have any other detail really to go on. But just tread with a degree of caution given some of the controversy around it previously.
Quite agree with your what you say, Graham, because obviously you always go with caution every time. So we agree we'll take this recommendation forward with the agreement what Graham says as well, okay? Yeah, agree, forum?
Yeah, I think any change going forwards will be driven by Senko networks. It's not, in no way is it sort of officer driven to meet council statutory responsibilities. No, absolutely not.
That's okay, now we need to take the second recommendation now, please.
It's disappeared, Bruce, I'm afraid. I've lost me. That's great. No, thank you. All options for development of in-house SEND provision, especially support bases and alternative provisions, are implemented in line with the SEND and AP place planning strategy. So the SEND and AP place planning strategy has a timeline to work with each partnership to develop partnership solutions for to appropriately meet the growth in need in each area. That document, some of the numbers in the document, not the processes, I don't think, but the numbers in the document have been updated. As it was the first time we'd predicted numbers going forwards as we had. I think we were 4 learners out or something when we checked the numbers in terms of first year projections. So it seems to be a tool which has been effective in predicting the numbers, but one of the outcomes of that strategy is to work. And so, for example, the Ashington Partnership now is moderately well progressing in terms of an Ashington solution for the challenges for Ashington going forwards. And so would wish to continue to do that, but it would appear from anecdotally from schools that have put their hand up and stepped forwards independently to increase provision, so the specialist support-based model is that is effective. And also individual solutions collectively at groups of schools seems to be the Ashington model. So really it's forum support to continue this way of working in terms of deliver more specialist provision closer to home.
Forum agree to the motion, to the recommendation? Do you want to say
something? I just suggest, obviously, we're doing a rework of the numbers, as David says, and that'll be ready for September. So perhaps the first meeting of forum in the new academic year, I suggest to bring that document here, so that we can seek everybody's views and give you a more formal feedback on the work that's already gone in that strategy.
Yeah, I know. Graham, please, first.
So I was just going to say, I get the sense if it wasn't recommended, you would do it anyway because it seems kind of sensible. But I think the way it's worded is, I would just soften it a bit because it's saying implement the plan. It's a plan that we haven't yet seen. So wouldn't want to hold back sensible work that's going on. But I think it could probably be rephrased as the way that you said is continue the work in relation to place planning and blah, 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 SEND and AP. But it sounded as if we were giving you carte blanche to drive something through that we haven't necessarily seen, which I think is probably semantics and pedantic, but I think it's still an important.
Quite agree with you, Graham. You're going to make a comment as well, sir?
Yeah, similar to what Graham said there. I think it's absolutely the right direction to go down. I think I'd probably like to see more forthcoming from NCC about how that actually looks, rather than it being school-led. You know, kind of hearing a bit more about the plans and what it looks like. It absolutely needs recommending from the forum, but it needs more meat behind the bones, I think.
Okay, then Sue, for the item for the agenda for September forum meeting, okay? So we'll put that on. Yeah, okay now. We'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, review post-16 SEND provision, consider new models. It is a broad look, and it's not something that we've done recently that I'm aware of. Sue, you might be able to put me wrong.
I don't think we have actually done.
Not collectively, so...
4 years ago, maybe.
Because I don't think we had a real update how what much cost out of our high needs for post-16 has been, is it? And how many actually pupils we have, or, you know.
The post-16 sector's massive in terms of the numbers of players.
Yeah.
They all do a tiny thing. The tiny thing is important for those families that they meet the need for, but there are hundreds of things going on, and independently driven.
So how quick could you get a report on the post-16 high need block? Could that be done for September one? I know you. I don't know.
Possibly one after September, because I think we'd
November.
November one.
Conscious of the September.
I don't know what he's
probably
doing
falls
during the
away.
school holiday, because he was saying out there, once the school's closed, he's got quite a bit of work to do with no holidays.
It's not about
Right, just to say, there's a triangulation of the data and making sure that placements are maintained for post-16 learners, and that data isn't collected until the after October half term.
Good point.
So it's more appropriate probably to bring that paper to the later school forum meeting.
So shall we somewhere in between, if we're going to bring it to the November one, somewhere between now, September and the November one, we have a high needs subcommittee just to take it forward for recommendations to school forum?
Okay.
Yeah.
Next one.
We'll do that then, right? Yeah.
Pilot Northam. Sorry.
I was just going to ask, when you're reviewing the post-16 SEND provision, will that include, is that just of the private sector or is it of all sectors?
Right across.
Every choice, Keith.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you,
So,
Keith, for that
at the
comment,
moment, there are colleagues pulling together perspectives of absolutely everything out there that post-16 young people are engaging with at the moment, and then that will go hand in hand with the money, and then we'll be able to see what the kind of potential is to do some work in the right areas and where it's needed.
So you've got a bit of work to do before November then. Keep you on your toes, yes?
Collectively.
Right, David, please.
Fourth point is the Northumberland Education Support Plan option. So this is to pilot, we've got some models that etc. that other local authorities have applied. Most of them are based around there's a COSA application, and at the end of the COSA application, this is another option. So currently the COSA application end is no, there will not be an EHC plan assessment. Normally that comes with support from a area Senko to go back to the school to explain the reasons and support that young person. Or sometimes it's a yes to go for statutory assessment and continue with that thing. But this would be something else. So there would be another option where it's progress to a Northumberland Education Support Plan option. And the finances for this will be looking at the notional figure was set 10 years ago at £6,000. So clearly there is a gap between what you could get 10 years ago for £6,000 and what you can get now. So this is about, I suppose, a viewpoint could be that this is about bolstering notional, and therefore we're not talking about £10,000 worth of top-up that goes with this, but to try and close the gap between the non-growth of notional funding at £6,000.
Yeah, I think, again, there's a little bit in the semantics of the wording of that particular recommendation around us recommending a pilot to investigate rather than implementing the thing through a pilot. And I think my other point is there is where does it sit with staff funding and how that's used particularly in
a replacement of.
A replacement of.
So staff funding.
So that needs to be quite
staff funding has been, bizarrely, it's actually been quite successful in an early years perspective, but it really, the model hasn't worked at all from a school-based perspective. It's worked in some individual cases, but collectively as a model for the whole of Northumberland, its impact has been almost none.
So would you be effectively looking at the money that's kind of allocated within the staff funding is going to be then sort of effectively transferred across, or how? I'd like to kind of see how that whole piece is going to work.
It would be targeted at a reduction in the top-ups that would have been paid had that learner progressed to a full EHC plan.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're dropping staff funding, then where's that money in the piece?
It sits in the in the same boat. The problem with the staff funding is that this idea that there are learners out there with short-term additional resource needs, which 10 weeks later, you know,
I mean,
don't need
was,
it.
whilst we're waiting for an EHCP, can we have some
That's
staff
right,
funding?
and
That's all
that's
it was.
not what. Yeah, that's how it was applied. But that's different to early years, where it could support speech and language developmental delay, at which point the learner actually does pick up those particular skills of speech, and therefore don't need that continuing support going forwards.
And then I guess the other part of that, from a funding perspective, is if it's going to be trialled in early years and Key Stage 1, how much of that is going to come from the early years part of the funding, and how much of that is going to be coming from the high needs block?
Okay.
I'm happy to share full proposals
Right.
for your input.
Right. You then, and then you. Okay, please, sir.
Just really quickly, I would definitely support exploring a pilot. I was going to make the same point about 6,000 doesn't buy you now what it did 10 years ago. And I think probably coupled to that would be if we're then looking to extend that to kind of other key stages and other phases, 6,000 doesn't buy you the same support, and the 6,000 isn't necessarily spent in the same way in different phases. And I think rather than just go, well, it works in early years in Key Stage 1, I'd then advocate a pilot of what it looks like in Key Stage 2 and what it looks like in Key Stage 3, 4, 5, because it's not the same.
Yeah.
Will this have an impact on COSA application process? So is that going to be reviewed in line with this? As in, would you have to be kind of on a SEN support plan, then on a Northumberland educational support plan, and then be in a position to apply for COSA? Because I think if that's going to be part of that whole process, we're probably, as a schools forum and wider schools forum, if that's a thing, need some guidance on that, because that will really affect and impact schools on their decision making around the level of funding and the level of support that's needed for different individuals, especially with the massive growth in SEMH need in schools nationally and locally.
The COSA process is the COSA process, and we're tied to that by the Code of Practice. So the COSA and the degree and the thresholds currently for COSA, which we attempt to share and apply to individual cases, as that's what SENCOs do, isn't it, all the time, is try and apply Code of Practice to the individual and then go. But the decision making for COSA will remain, does the learner, the two-part test, does the learner have a special educational need, and does the school require additional resources to meet that need? Right. So the two-part test remains the same. What the focus for this would be on the second part there, does the school need additional resources to meet that need? In the current COSA process, which wouldn't change, at that point, currently at the end of the COSA process, 6 weeks for the consideration of statutory assessment, at the end of that, the school either get a no or a yes, we're progressing to a full AHC plan. This would be add another option at that point. So it's not, I don't think it would be brilliant if SEND support became a Northumberland education support plan and we had money for every learner on SEND support. It just doesn't exist at the minute. That would be, and that we wouldn't need to really discuss that before him. Everyone would be a fan of that, and you know, and so on and so forth. Hopefully we could get to a position of that in the future. If the funding increases, we could look at that. But no, this is to support schools with learners that fit between what current notional pays and what the EHC plan pays, with a view to, it is attempting to stop the growth in EHC plans by putting another stepping stone in. Not one that you have to touch, because if the two-part test is well met, and because one of the ideally, what we're looking at is something we go, okay, we thought an EHC plan would be suitable, we've been through the process and we recognise actually that this Northumberland plan will meet needs, so we don't need, we now have the resource to meet the need for this learner, so we don't need to go to plan. And then alternatively, leaving the resources, particularly EP, but also the statutory SEND team resources in terms of the administration of the plan. If less people do progress to a full plan, those that do progress will be able to progress faster and will be able to meet their needs earlier and support parental demand earlier. but there's some real potholes to fall down. One is, how will parents respond to it? And it will need to be promoted really constructively as being a really good, high-quality option. And also for schools themselves to recognise that as well, and not put every learner on SEND support into the system. And suddenly we've got, 200,000 COSA applications for everyone's trying to get an Northumberland education. We need to collectively recognise where its place could be.
Right. I know time is ticking on fast now. Recommendation that we obviously support the pilot scheme and everything like that, and the full thing, yes, from Forum. And Nancy, yeah. So you hope to roll that out somewhere from September onwards, David, yeah? Yeah, very good, okay then. Right, the next one, develop policy. Well, that's obviously, there's a report coming back to, obviously, so that one will leave in abeyance. And then number 6 on here, consider the whole school trust financial position balances when decided on top-up growth requests. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'd said before about I was anxious about taking back schools that have been good with their money. I think the 10%, 16% is a real sensible move, and actually I really support that. If the school's got 10%, they're not a
It's a test.
Oh yeah, well that's it. If it was real, I'd be like.
I saw no one panicking at the front, so I didn't. But I really welcome it. I think it's a real strong move. I think the trust one is the one I'd probably have a question mark over, as to A, how readily accessible do you have of their balances, and B, one school can be managing their finances really well in a trust, and just because one isn't, where does that lie? So I think the school-based financial position is a really strong move. It's what Bruce said earlier about that mandatory clawback anyway at 10%, 16%, it would backfill the budget quite a bit. So I'm in full support.
Yes, sir.
I'd caution against the snapshot in a moment of time, because schools that may be holding 10% or 16% now, over a 3-year picture might not be.
Yeah, I agree.
And we don't know what's happening, and in kind of short-term funding settlements, or lack of any funding settlements at all at the moment from government, until we know what that picture looks like, to just effectively penalise a school because they're planning for the future, for an unknown future, doesn't sit with me, especially if you've got that kind of, if those needs are growing and those learners are growing within the schools, to then say, well, actually, you've got loads of money, without looking at the bigger picture and the longer term picture, that just doesn't quite sit with me, I'm afraid.
Keith?
Yeah, I mean, my observation is that what happens in 1 year, you may be not get the 25% increase or whatever, but the forecast for the next year, you could easily be in a deficit. And the issue then is you're increasing the deficit by not improving the top-up, is my observation.
I suppose I agree your points completely, but this is a question of where to set the cushion. And that if previously you had a 16% cushion in the year before, then that will influence the next 12 months. But then if you are then below your 16% cushion because of in-year spend, quite legitimate, then you would be eligible for that additional support going forwards. Beyond that, it's that the scenario is that the top-up maintains the balance above the cushion level, and therefore is that high needs money being spent on high needs children?
There's an argument there, as David saying, that might be a cause and effect factor. If that causes some balances to be spent to support high needs learners, in practice, that might be a good thing. But again, as ever, we get...
for an accountant. Only for an accountant.
Might be good for that high needs learner as well. So again, I mean, what we're seeing is applications back almost on a sort of termly cycle, not an annual one at the moment. And it's just to sort of try to put some sort of structure and some breaks around that. But I'd say it would have to be reviewed on an annual basis.
Yeah. And again, we're not talking about cutting current funding. There could have been a whole swathe of recommendations about cutting. This is about requested increases for top-up.
You had a question,
I think the difference with that one against most of the recommendations. Most of the recommendations are kind of solid plans for systemic change. That one, I think, is just kicking the can down the line by a year or two potentially, because if schools are already holding money in reserve for other things, and therefore they don't get additional growth money here, that either causes them to cut elsewhere, or it just means they're coming back for more money next year. So for me, that one's just kicking it down the line rather than actually changing how we do things.
Yeah. Graham, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the principle about not cutting but just kind of limiting growth is fine, but actually where top-ups is concerned, unless I'm misunderstanding what you mean, each year there's going to be growth because there's new cohorts coming in, so I think we've got to be careful that, you know, I think it's potentially a bit disingenuous to suggest, you know, it's holding a line, well, cohorts leave, new ones come through, each year group is different, and, you know, I think that needs clarifying. But I think the broader point on the percent, 10% for a secondary high school isn't necessarily a huge amount. Reserves policies would probably be in that, but quite often they could be running at kind of 4 weeks, which isn't a million miles away from 10%. So I think there is a risk here that those trusts that maybe are building up some contingency because of something they know down the line, and there was talk earlier about contingencies to do with redundancies and restructuring, for example, just as an example, or new build projects, or you know, etc., etc. So I think in principle it's fine, but in practice I think we've just got to have some caveats in there. And I would hate to think, which is sometimes the impression that's created around decision-making panels around top-ups in HCPs, is it's very close, it's not particularly transparent, and you know, decisions are made that seem a bit arbitrary. That may be unfair, but I think this has got the case that may well, you know, contribute to that. So I think a real clarity, maybe a discourse, and some really clear criteria beyond just a percentage. That in the past, actually, for schools was 12%. That was a clawback that the national government, I think, was proposing a number of years ago.
So we send it back to the officers to relook at this then, yeah?
Shall we just change the words in the recommendation to say that we would set up a working party to develop what that policy would look
Well,
like?
I think that would be very good.
To take into account the nuances that we've talked about here.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, you know, there has been some support within the room around the levels that we set, but let's work through perhaps some of the scenarios that means, you know, perhaps we could bring something back to a later forum. You know, September probably might be a bit quick, but set up a bit of a group to actually look at that, so it isn't, so we've got a firm policy that we can consult on.
Would the formula funding committee look at that when I look at doing with funding and stuff over there?
Yes, it would be high needs.
High
It's
needs,
maybe something we need to bring back, the high needs first of all. Just picking up a couple of the points for discussion or subsequent discussion, and I'm pressed for time. Obviously, Graham, when we raised this at the previous High Needs Committee meeting, there was some valid discussion, but it was felt best on an academy at a trust level basis. But within an academy trust, you will have a mix of primary and secondary schools. So it's again, we'd have to look at any sort of threshold in light of that. I'm not proposing to sort that now. I'm just sort of highlighting that for a point of further.
Well, we'll put this on abeyance. Yeah. We'll put this on abeyance until obviously the working party set up and everything like that, so we can come back at that, right?
And the final point, I think, for some assurances, I think it has been specifically targeted around those where an individual student is already receiving top-up and there's a request for a higher level of top-up going in, rather than a new application.
Okay, right. Agree then. We'll put this back. Right, well, the next one is apply for new payment timelines. Very quickly, David, because time's ticking on as well.
Well, that's it. Do we pay notional at the start of the term? Do we pay any agreed increases in top up for the start of the following term?
What about when you have children who, you know, it's like an immediate need, that wouldn't, and you've got to buy extra resources? You know, that wouldn't allow for that, would it?
No, I mean the knock-on effect here is a drain on school funds, in order to save the central pot from overspending as much. I can't wrap it up in a better way. It is the school but the school know that something will be coming. There is an increase on its way. and you currently manage within the resources or the school balances that you've currently got. Now, if that takes you below down to 9%, then it might come back at another time. You know what I mean? But
I think in practice, that's probably what's happening in practice at the moment anyway, Andrea, that you're putting resources in place. There's very few applications by the time something hits either panel or bespoke funding group. Very few applications are agreed retrospectively, unless there is an exceptional case of significant demand and draw. It's just trying to sort of quantify that and put it forward as a contribution towards the potential savings, so it would be standardised and stated, as opposed to probably implicitly done anyway.
And there's small benefit, but if it did come to pass, then at least people will, there's a bit of added certainty, even if it might be certainly not as good as it was. But at the minute, there's the uncertainty. Will I get it back paid to January? Is it starting today? When do I get the money and all that? But at least there would be a consistency and a transparency and all of those sorts of things, so people would know in advance.
You want to make a point?
Yeah, it's just a small point on that one, really, and it's about that clawback if you've got a child that changes school partway through a term, and where that money then lies and who then takes the responsibility for that, I think. And I think there is a piece of work to be done around that whole
I think the principle that we've always said, and it's in the current policy, that the funding transfers with the pupil. I think in that instance,
at what point?
where we're running one, I think we can, it's the same students, same needs, it's just being delivered in a different facility.
So Forum, do you agree for this recommendation, or do you want to put it on hold for further? Agreed with that one. Okay, then right, fair enough then, right?
Early years block to pay the totality of the early years inclusion fund?
Have we got anybody from early years in the audience today or not? Because I would rather have a conversation with them before we make that decision.
Just Kath's not here.
Kath's not here, so can we put that back until this September meeting? Well, yeah, I mean, obviously you've got
I think that's an internal decision, isn't it? It's about...
Yeah.
It won't affect
I think the danger of deferring all of these, there's not going to be enough action in time to address the issue we've got. So I think we do need to have some decisions. And I think if you look at the paper that Bruce presented around balances, there is enough money in the system. It's just where that money lies. So overall, the deficits we've got in our blocks and in our schools could be balanced. The discussion here is about how we make that happen. So I don't think deferring anything from this meeting, we've talked about it now for over a year. I really think that today is the time to make some decisions.
I would add to that corporate finance have worked out the inclusion fund balance. We have projected it within the early years fund going forward, and it makes no difference overall to the carry forward in that early years block that I have shown you through that.
I want to pinch Keith's line from earlier. That is an accountancy thing. It should have it will have no impact on that early years practitioner.
I know as chair, I just want to make sure it's fair, because obviously Kath's not here. So we take that recommendation on board. Okay, then, fair enough now.
Considerations for a 1%, bearing in mind that we would have to go to the Secretary of State for agreement on that. But whether the Schools Forum would promote that or not, I don't know.
The process around that is we bring an additional policy update in September. There would be specific proposals coming in November, which would need Schools Forum support or otherwise. If Schools Forum support it, we'd still have to seek Secretary of State approval. If Schools Forum didn't approve it, we'd as a council, we'd still have to go to the Secretary of State saying it didn't have Schools Forum support, but this is the balance of evidence. So again, it's one that won't have an immediate impact today, but it's about that. That's how the process will go forward.
Also depends on our new government, and obviously having two MPs in the north of the country, both in high power jobs. I don't know if Forum should write and say, what is, or even from the combined authorities as well, right? To say very clearly, this is the situation, especially in Northumberland. We get a child excluded in Berwick and needs to be, educated in Ashington or Bedlington or Blythe. The cost is, I think you maybe give them a bus pass, but you've got to think how long it takes for a bus to get from Berwick to Blythe. Okay, yes, Graham, you're going to say.
Yeah, I feel uncomfortable about this one for two reasons. One, I think it goes against the principle of not cutting, because in effect it would be cuts to the schools block and therefore schools budgets. I think the principle of sort of restricting further growth and allowing over time income to catch up, I think is a good one. And actually things may change, they may not change, but I think we should be very careful about making swinging cuts too much too early if there are better times ahead, he says optimistically. The other point is, going back to Bruce's paper on deficits, there are a number of schools that are in deficit, and even those that are not cumulatively, I think there are more that have got in-year deficits. So I'd be reluctant to add to that facing individual schools. So I think we keep it under review, but I would be very reluctant to be advocating more coming out of the schools block at this time, given the circumstances facing individual schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we should really keep an eye on exactly what's happening and everything, because we don't know if, you know, this new government's going to bite the bullet and give that extra money for high needs. You know, we're not the only authority throughout the country, so there must be, everybody must be knocking on the education department's doors and saying we need more money for this because of things. So I think we just obviously wait and see, and then see what happens, right? And then obviously go through the procedures like we do each year, you know, come there where we are.
I mean, in practice, that's something we will specifically take a formal vote on in November anyway. I don't know whether it's beneficial at this point to take the temperature of the land as it currently lies, in terms of where members lie, in terms of the schools forum, given that it's clearly not a binding decision at this point. So obviously, clearly there are some members against it. It would be interesting in terms of wider picture, and you know, and again, reinforcing everything David said, it's not about taking funding back. It's just where it's being recycled to in terms of the the areas of the high needs demands.
So
I mean, well, we'll be debating in November the current 0.5%. So no doubt it will raise its head at that point.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's an unknown thing. If Graham knew the lottery numbers, I'll be asking him for if we could forecast, you know, what was going to happen. We can't, can we? We don't know until, you know, things do. So I would say by September we should have some ideas. Certainly by November we will have the idea of what we need to do and everything like that. So I would say very clearly during the next term in the academic year we should have some idea where we are. So
it'll still be a December settlement.
I'm waiting for you. Okay, right. So
the final one's probably less contentious.
Yeah, well, honestly, yes. Well, yes, it's something that we've been asking for, obviously, up-termly things, so we agree, yes, for them. Look, I'm sorry, officers, but you have to do a bit of homework as well.
Do it anyway.
Sorry to come in again. Just that, I think on that point, given some of the decisions, if you like, we're making, some deferring, but I wonder if we have, rather than kind of use the term again, baking these in, so for example, the one around delaying payments until the start of the next term, that we just kind of keep these under review and don't necessarily have them in the system forevermore, never to be reviewed again. So whether that's annual, that might be too frequent, or, you know, every couple of years, I don't know, that's something to perhaps think about. But I think coming back to these decisions, which are unpalatable, as we've discussed previously, and just see if there's scope to deviate, although it'll probably be a case of adding to, I'm sure, in a year or two's time. But I think that point's an important one.
I quite agree. I quite agree with you, Graham. I mean, all our decision and forum should be kept under review and things like that, because things change all the time. I know time's ticking on and everything like that, so we have one more item or two more items on the thing. So I think the next one. Thanks, David, for that report and presentation. I don't know how long yours going to take, Bruce, on the thingy, Bob.
I can read the room, Chair. Again, it may worry you to see there's probably out 30-odd pages to the next agenda item. The good news, it's a fairly formulaic one. We're required by the ESFA to bring the scheme for financing schools annually to Schools Forum for approval for adoption from September. The report sort of, you know, states the position around that. There are very few changes proposed, both either directed changes from the ESFA or changes proposed from the local authority. There is a clarification specifically included, and that's been highlighted in yellow within the report, where around the position of in relation to leases. You know, again, it's a clarification and direction from the ESFA, so we've simply incorporated that into the proposed scheme for financing school scheme, maintained school scheme.
Right.
Are there any questions or objections in relation to that?
Yeah, it's just a real niche one, Bruce, in terms of, I think it's on page 11, 3.5.1, in terms of restrictions on accounts to banks. We just check that all schools have access to those banks, obviously with banks closing in towns, that they may be using or have to use banks locally to them that aren't on the list.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
Do
yeah,
that from a
yeah,
point of view
yes,
of cashiers,
please,
yeah.
yeah.
It's a niche question, but in current climate...
Oh yeah, I quite agree,
there's lots
because
of
the amount of banks are closing, I mean, yeah, if you've got Lloyds in Blythe, in your school in Blythe, Lloyds is closing in Blythe, so where do you go now? Yeah.
It's not, I mean, our maintained schools continue with bank. It's not been flagged as an issue, but that's certainly something we take up through questions. Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay. We take that
Callum, can you look into that over there, that little bit there? Yeah, yeah, because there are a number of banks closing, you know, within every town, isn't it? So if you're banking with Lloyds in Blythe, then you've got a bit of a problem. You'll have to go to Cramerton or into Newcastle if you've got money to put in.
So with that observation, are we happy to accept that?
Yeah.
Seeing as it stands?
Yeah, okay then, right. And the final one is the working programme. You've got that, I can't think, give you some dates for the meeting.
Yes,
Yeah,
really
okay.
it's a question of provisional
Yeah.
dates through to next February for your diary, please.
Right, and obviously there'll be the High Needs Committee.
We'll look to
that'll be
incorporate
slotted
one of
in,
those
yeah.
in October.
There's been no other business as chair, so obviously I can say very clearly on behalf of the school forum, as I always say to all the head teachers when I'm in school appeals, you've got so many Getty Up days. I think some of you only got 1 or 2 Getty Up days before you finish, right? It's been a hard academic year for you all, and I think as a chair of governors, I think, you know, you all need a great thanks to your head teachers and everything like that for the amount of work you have to put in and everything like that, especially with high needs and everything like that. I mean, my school only had 2 children with educational care plan. We're now up to 7, so in a primary school, which is very, you know, very hard and everything like that. So, yeah. So, thank you for making my job very easy as a chair, obviously online and thingy Bob, and for high needs. It's been a great pleasure to serve with you, and I hope you all have a great summer holiday. Relaxed, as my CEO from my trust says, do not take anything home in your boot or your car, like files and everything there, because it's all going to be there in September when you come back. Enjoy your holidays, right? And let the officers of the council sort everything out for you while you're on holiday, so when you come back then you can have it. Anyway, thank you so much. So the next meeting is on the 25th of September, 9:30, and it'll be on Teams, okay? Thank you very much for your time, and I was sorry it's overrun and everything like that, which obviously now, and I